Hello. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're recording. So thank you so much, Ambassador McCarney, for speaking to us today. My name is Quinn, and I'm the comms exec for the IRSOC. And Vamika
And
is the. You can introduce yourself too.
yeah, and my name is Vamika. I am the VP Communications for IRSOC. We're going to be asking you some questions on behalf of the IR community today. And yes, let's just get started.
Okay. So to start off with, could you tell us a little bit about your experience in, like, with your first year teaching at U of T, and I guess particularly teaching a course like multilateral diplomacy, which is evolving so rapidly given the present circumstances.
I'm happy to, and thanks so much for letting me kick off this term. It's an unusual term for sure, but all I can say is my first impressions of the last few weeks is everyone's trying so hard to make it work, and clearly the fact that we're here and able to get things done reflects a lot of work over the summer by faculty and staff and students. It's quite amazing to watch the community and the solidarity that at least I'm experiencing. So let me just say that, and thank you for allowing me to be the inaugural person. Yeah, so it's only week 3. Actually, I have done 2 classes so far in multilateral diplomacy, global governance, and so it's a learning curve, no question, for everyone. I think the students have told me that I am typical, that I'm not intimidated by the substantive side of the course, but rather making sure that the technology works, not just in a technical sense, but that it works so that the students who are online, as well as the students who are in class, because I'm doing a dual platform approach, have the same experience. And how do you make that happen? And how do you use the technology to it's within its limitations, but also within its opportunities, to make it work so that we feel like one class, not 2 classes, and you can give that same level of engagement that everybody's very used to when we're all sitting in one place together. So yes, I find that it's probably more work this year than I've had experience in the past with teaching because of that, because you're always thinking how it's going to work online and how do I make it come alive for people. So the students are probably far better than I am about that, but I find that a little stressing. But in terms of the content and this time in world history and world politics, it's a lot of fun because, of course, the issues that we're dealing with in class are, they're in the throne speech of last week, and then they're in the UN debates at UNGA this week. And so I'm trying to keep some flexibility so I can pull in highly contemporary events while still providing that contextual place that is pretty solid, at least over the last 50, 70 years, and then where the pressure points are, where we can expect changes, both because of changing situations politically in the world, and the world, of course, in the middle of a global pandemic. And so there's lots of puts and takes right now. And so how do you keep that dynamic as well while making sure you cover kind of that contextual piece? And so I'm trying to bridge between 4th year students who've done a lot of studying on institutions and treaties, and kind of the grittiness of diplomacy itself in negotiations and trying to get resolutions through, et cetera, that is also part of my background.
Thank you so much. And our second question is that while carrying the immense responsibility of representing Canada on a global stage and also managing what is an extremely busy career, how did you still manage to take time for yourself, to retain a sense of personal identity almost? And what kind of advice would you give to students to emulate that in some ways?
I'm not sure emulation is something I would recommend to students. I think everybody has to find their own pathways and figure out. I've always been, frankly, a little disdainful of the discussions around work-life balance. I think some people's work-life balance is a passion for the work they're doing, and so, you know, they're not very good at, you know, keeping other parts of their life going. But, you know, I think that's kind of self-definitions. I think you have to figure out what that balance, so-called balance is, and it's not, you know, 50-50 or 60-40, it's what works for you. And I think, you know, I think students are figuring that out as students, juggling, you know, sometimes part-time work and family obligations, as well as heavy course material. So you're figuring that out all through life. As a woman, as a professional, you figure out, you know, there's rhythms to life, and there's maybe a time when you think about children, and there's a time later when you might have obligations with respect to grandchildren, and so there's a rhythm to life, a life cycle, and I think you're always balancing, rebalancing. And I've often said to friends and colleagues, like, don't be too hard on yourself, but once a year, take stock. Once a year, kind of sit back and say, did I get it mostly right this year? You know, with your kids and your partner and your aging parents and your own fitness and things. Did I get it mostly right? But if you try and do that assessment week to week or month to month, you're never going to be very happy with it. And I think that's true as you make career choices as well. And so, you know, you ask about risk and things of that nature, and it's like, everybody has a different risk tolerance, you know, and I think with the pandemic, we've come to understand that even better. I, for one, will not, you know, jump or judge people who are more cautious than me on movement in the pandemic or less cautious than me. I do fully will judge people who don't follow the science and the government guidelines in terms of distancing and mask wearing and sanitizing, etc. But in terms of where people place themselves, even within a family, I think those risk tolerance, we're learning a lot about risk, and that's transferable to the choices students are making as they leave a college like Trinity and maybe consider grad school, or may consider a gap year, or may consider a job that may not be quite right, but might get them a foothold into a work environment. I think you have to come to terms with your risk tolerance on careers and career choices. And maybe when you take a lateral move, or you take a step back because of those other aspects in that so-called work-life balance, etc. And I think figuring out your risk tolerance is an important part of growing and maturing as a student.
Thank you so much. Our next question was actually going to be about risks and making difficult career choices. But I think we could ask instead, since you've kind of answered it in that question, what are some things about a career in diplomacy that people might not necessarily know from the outside, like some kind of misperceptions or misrepresentations?
There's probably a lot of misperceptions, and I certainly had them as well before jumping into it. You know, diplomacy is, you're actually exercising diplomacy a lot through life. You know, when you're negotiating relationships, or when you're negotiating, you know, work choices or career choices, or where you land. And so in the sense of formal diplomacy, it's kind of been, you know, a little bit of a cloistered, misunderstood, perhaps purposefully not well understood. But when you really think about what you're trying to do, you're advocating, and you're advocating on behalf of a government and the people of your country on issues that they have identified in democratic governments like Canada, they have identified as key foreign policy priorities of the country. And so your role is to be an effective advocate, and you do that through relationship building. You do it through knowing, for example, your toolbox of precedents, your toolbox of those who you know you should go to first because they may be like-minded. But I would also say a high awareness and a really working intuitiveness in terms of those who might just be on the periphery, who may not have agreed with Canada or may not have agreed with you in other areas, but situationally, great potential for bringing them on side to move an agenda, to seek consensus on a resolution, for example, that Canada may be advancing. And so I affectionately call them the unlikely like-minded as well. And so too often, I think in the world of diplomacy, we're really pigeonholed. We're pigeonholed by history, we're pigeonholed by regional groupings. And I think one of the most important things as a diplomat today is breaking out of that and looking for those unlikely like-minded who may not be quite so happy with their regional grouping or say their movement or their coalition, and maybe finding more common purpose with yours. I think you have to be quite open to seeking those folks out and then trying to create the accommodations to bring them in.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting answer. Okay, on a slightly different note, what are you reading these days?
You know, people ask me what I read, and I sometimes look back at what I've read over the last 3 or 6 months, and I kind of laugh and think, oh, I don't want to share that. I'm a very eclectic reader, truly an eclectic reader. And so on the bedside table on the weekend, I was reading about kind of robbers and iconic people in the area around where we have a cottage, which is a really ancient, relatively speaking, part of Canadian history, because it's the area where the settlers came with land grants from the Napoleonic War. So there's kind of a settler 220 year history there. And let's just say the early folks in the timber industry and the sawmill industry, etc., were as notorious as some of the robber barons of today, but we don't often hear that history. So just to say, my eclectic reading, I read a Dan Brown novel this summer on the plague, the one on the plague. That was kind of fun. I said to someone, the first 30 pages is like a literary parkour in terms of how you feel reading it. But then, to be quite honest, I am so deep into the course and, you know, making sure I've got a good handle on the course readings that I'm rereading all of those each week. So kind of eclectically, and I love children's literature. So I like to read children's literature to kind of get a sense of kind of the audience and where the audience are moving, and then just the amazing children's literature authors in this country and the creative things that they're putting in front of children. So yes, highly eclectic.
Thank you. So I guess we couldn't help but throw in like a very IR question. So we were going to ask, in an age of, you know, growing nationalism, isolationism, where do you think the future of multilateral diplomacy is headed?
I think the future of multilateralism and multilateral diplomacy is great. So I am, you know, you can be highly cognizant of the headlines and what's going on, but what I see is a grouping and regrouping and reassertion of the real value of multilateralism, because that there's nothing that we are facing, whether it's climate change or whether it's global pandemics, absolutely none of the key things that we're facing can be solved by military means, not one. And that's not being about anti-military or anti-force. There's just absolutely no military solution for any of those. The absolutely only pathway to come to terms with the things that are affecting this very small, fragile planet is through diplomacy and multilateralism, and getting more and more like-minded together, and recognizing that takes accommodation and compromise and, you know, sometimes frustrating moments. But the only way we're going to protect the people of this planet and get to a better place as we've been doing through history with rapid increases in literacy, rapid increases in nutrition, etc., it's through the multilateral systems, and with all of their flaws and the mistakes that get made, with all due respect to the critics, there is no better system that we've been able to put forward. So let's kind of address the issues and the gaps and maybe the weaknesses, but let's remember that for the most part, these are highly robust places. And some of the headlines is, for domestic consumption. It's not about what they're actually doing in front of the scenes and behind the scenes in the United Nations.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's a very positive outlook for the future in some ways. We did also want to ask you, what advice would you give to students graduating from the IR program who are trying to envision their career now in a completely changing economy and completely changed professional environment? Any last thoughts on that, particularly with reference to your experience with foreign service, but we also know that you went from law to NGOs to diplomacy to even writing children's books. So for students graduating from IR, what are some of the advice that you would give them for their future?
Well, I feel like I've had just a gifted time through my career because I have crossed all those sectors and have taken those risks, and I've been able to do it, and there's lots of reasons I've been able to do it perhaps more easily than others from different backgrounds and contexts, etc. But I think in terms of the students, it's, I think a number of the international relations students may have a preconceived notion of how career paths should go and what a successful career path looks like. And I think one thing that I would suggest is just, constantly check your assumptions in terms of a successful career path. What does that look like? How much intrinsic value do you feel that you need personally and professionally to be able to offer? And what is the level of commitment you're prepared to make? And so, success is a very broad spectrum, and it's got to work for each individual. And I think in terms of the preconceived notions, that also goes to kind of the physical career pathing that may have worked 5 years ago and 10 years ago, but may not work today. And so that ability to kind of keep building your toolbox, and your toolbox is not just your academic credentials, but also your personal response credentials to situations, and seeing opportunities and seizing opportunities is really important. And I know that sounds trite, but I mean that quite sincerely, because diplomacy is exercised everywhere. I was probably as much a diplomat in civil society, when we moved things like the International Day of the Girl, or we moved things like the original maternal newborn health agenda, the MNCH agenda, that then became the MNCH reproductive health agenda, through the G, then it was the G8. Those were all diplomatic endeavors from civil society that made enormous differences around the world. And so a foreign policy career through the government of Canada is absolutely fantastic. Or through the United Nations, there's many Canadian UN diplomats representing the UN, not Canada. And then there's many, I would say, some of the best diplomats I know working in civil society. So there's a number of places to go. You're first and foremost an advocate for the things you care about. And so, figure out what's your passion, and then figure out how to make a living from it. And that was the best advice I ever got in my early 20s.
Thank you so much for that. That's very valuable advice. So I think that's all of the questions that we had for you today. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the IRSOC and the IR community at U of T for taking the time to speak with us as our first community showcase interview. It was fantastic to be able to pick your brain for half an hour. And I hope you have a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you very much. And thanks so much for doing this, because I enjoy also hearing back from the students at all times.
Thank you. Okay, I'll pause the recording here.